Yeah, and thank you, Jim. And I unfortunately have messed up that structure before we've even gotten started because I have a too long a presentation for the time allotted for this today. So if I'm going to skip some sections and move past some things pretty quickly in order to have time for our colleagues to present and discussion. This is the outline of the talk. I started to change it, and then I thought I was going to get my numbering all off. So as a consequence, I'll just go quickly through a bunch of things. And in particular, this first section on how networks influence behavior, because it's probably familiar to a lot of you already through the work that we did. And I have this sort of stylized presentation about the ways that networks influence behavior from a structural perspective. We talk about exposure models. We talk about perceived influences rather than actual self-report influences, which are C and F. If ego perceives C and F to do something, they're more likely to be influenced by them, regardless of whether or not they actually do it. And then we have Somalian ties, increase the influence of alters. If your network is filled with others that are all connected to one another, you're in a highly constrained situation, and as a consequence, the alters have a stronger influence on ego than they don't. We have tie strength as an issue. We have indirect ties, potentially influencing alters. And that's an open research question because some people say it's 2 steps, some people say it's 3 steps, and we don't know about whether or not the intermediaries need to be engaged in the behavior. And then, of course, we can have network-weighted influences, right? So in this context, if E is very popular, they're likely to have a stronger influence on ego than other people randomly in the network. You can particularly think about that in the adolescent context, right? Popular kids in schools have stronger influences on others. And then the idea of structural equivalence, which has been around for a long time in network analysis. There are theoretical and empirical evidences why structurally equivalent alters may have a stronger influence than others. And then, of course, we can expand and contract that sphere of influence, right, by looking at direct, indirect, and further out ties, and so on. And then my own discovery of thresholds, right? When I was analyzing diffusion data back, three plus decades ago with the medical innovation data, I created exposure models. Exposure wasn't associated with behavior. And my advisor, Ev Rogers, who's pretty well known for talking about exposure, being associated with behaviors, and I didn't see it in the data, and I started to panic, and I thought, oh crap, I'm not going to get my PhD because the data doesn't say what it's supposed to. And I had the epiphany that, well, we can't wait for everybody to have a majority of people in their network to adopt, otherwise nothing would ever spread. So there have to be some people in the community that have low thresholds that are willing to adopt before others adopt, right? And in fact, you can think about your own behaviors, whether or not you have a low or a high threshold. I am a high threshold adopter, right? Unabashedly, I wait until everybody else does something before I'm willing to do it. And why is that? Because I'm smart, right? Why would I do something before everybody else does it? Wait until it's used. I know I can go to others to get advice on how it works and whatnot. And I always make the joke that, low threshold people do something that I would never, ever in my life do. Read the manual, right? Because they're the ones that they do it before everybody else does, so they have to figure out how it works. And then this is just a nice graph that I used to illustrate what thresholds are. Traditionally, we classify people as early or late adopters along the x-axis, but we can also graph them as whether or not they're early or late on the y-axis. And so what happens, of course, is we see that there are people that would normally be classified as early adopters, but in fact, they're late in their network. And then, of course, we have online influences. We have bipartite networks where we can look at, if people are engaged in events and activities together, they're more likely to influence them. And then we can lay attributes over top of that, right? Communication theory would always suggest that people who are homophilous are more likely to influence one another because of those shared things. And so I usually conclude this part by saying that's networks of behavior change. Let's segue into talking about networks for behavior change, which really is the topic for today. And just a quick plug, all those kind of structural network influences we have built into our R package net diffuser, which enables you to do all of those things with just toggling a switch here and there. So it saves a ton of time because in my PhD, I wrote all that stuff in Gauss and then got, moved over to I did it actually all in SAS, proc IML, then had to do it in Gauss, and now we've done it in R. And I think that's the last time we have to rewrite all those things. So a number of years ago, we published this paper on network analysis for program implementation. It's the SNAPPY, keep that in your mind. And we basically, like program evaluation in other fields, we have these stages in the implementation process. And what we did in this paper, of course, is just talk about the different things you can do with networks as you move through these stages of implementation. And of course, we don't have a lot of work in this area, this notion of network ethnography, but if you're going to do an intervention, it's really smart to think about looking at the network, trying to map it, and figure out ways that the network may be implicated and involved in defining the program and designing the program. And I like to say that typically what happens, of course, is we work with communities, we find the people that are most central in that network, and they help us define the program, design it, and so on. But then, of course, it ignores the isolates that usually are the ones that are most in need of some kind of intervention, or, these disconnected subgroups that are actually the ones that are at high risk. You think about a high school or any kind of community, it's this group out here that may be engaging in a whole bunch of risky behaviors, and they're not part of the system. Okay, and then the bulk of the work I've been doing lately is this notion of networks for designing programs, right? And many of you may be familiar with this paper I published a while ago, Network Interventions. And as Jim said, I've actually expanded this work into a full-length book, which is gone through a couple rounds of review so far. And so network interventions, not surprisingly, I define them quite broadly. Anytime we use network data to generate social influence, accelerate behavior change, improve performance, and or achieve desirable outcomes among individuals, communities, organizations, or populations. In essence, we can do everything, right? But before I talk about the details and specifics, I like to point out that there are a couple of principles that are critical every time we do an intervention, but become highlighted in particular when we talk about it in a network context, right? And so the first one is that our program goals matter, right? So sometimes we want to increase cohesion, or sometimes we want to increase fragmentation. And the example I often use is the idea of slowing the spread of STDs or STIs. And in that case, we may want to fragment that transmission network, or we may want to accelerate the uptake of condoms and other protective behaviors. And secondly, I came into the social sciences with a math background, didn't know anything about social sciences, and I thought, we don't know anything about behavior, right? I mean, people, one day they may spend the day on the couch watching movies, the next day they may be, going off to a baseball game or whatever. People are hard to predict. But I think actually in the past couple of decades, we've done a pretty good job of understanding what are the motivations and barriers to behavior change. We have pretty good theoretical models, and although it's easy to say, maybe harder to do, but a good, well-articulated theory about what's motivating behavior can oftentimes be quite important for bringing about change. And then finally, my goal when I started designing network interventions back in the mid-90s, I was like, this is great. I'm going to write a program. We're going to push that lever. Everybody's going to change their behavior. The money's just going to come pouring in. I'll be rich and famous, and I'll get tenure, right? But of course, that's not the way it happens. We have to think about it as a process where our job is learning from the community as much as trying to change it. So this is the big table. Gotten a lot of press. And basically, it breaks it down into strategies, tactics, and operationalization, which are words that you hear a lot, particularly now that we're always in this political campaign mode. We talk about, what's the strategy, what are the tactics, what are the operationalizations. And the easiest way to interpret this table is to just look at this first row right here, where the strategy is identifying individuals that are going to be our change agents, right? And what's the tactic that we're going to use? Well, typically, we try to find opinion leaders. And we'll probably hear a lot about popular opinion leaders this morning. And then, of course, from a network perspective, how do you identify the most central node in a network? Well, it turns out we have lots of measures for that, right? Degree, closeness between this, eigenvector, you've heard a lot of those. And in fact, at last count, we have over 100 unique algorithms to define the most central node in a network. So you have a ton of choices, but typically we always just use in degree. All right, so why network opinion leaders? Well, they're easy to identify, it's intuitive, and even a decade ago, we had discovered over 20 studies that have used network-identified opinion leaders to be change agents and found them to be quite successful. And in fact, it came about in this paper that we did where it occurred to me that there are lots of different ways in public health we try to identify opinion leaders, right? And we use these different kinds, celebrities, self-selection, self-identification, and whatnot. And so we went through and we downloaded a couple thousand abstracts in the public health literature. We went through them all to put them into these different bins, how many that are going to do that. And this was way back in 2006 and 2007. And I started to write the discussion section of the paper before we'd finished the data because I knew intuitively in my heart, we never do this, right? And I wrote the discussion section saying, the problem is, these things are not as valid and reliable, and this is the best way to do it. And of course, then we go through all these abstracts and we find 20 different studies that had actually done that. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. This is all in the literature? And it turns out that they were all in different places, right? There was one for kidney disease and one for HIV and one for acute myocardial infarction. And so what you realize, of course, is in our public health world, the National Institutes of Health is organized by organ and disease, not by health, right? And so all of these things have been funded by different institutes and they had not really cross-referenced one another. And then we run simulations, which is a lot of fun, right? You can generate a whole bunch of synthetic communities. You can seed the initial adopters to be opinion leaders, randomly selected or marginals. And of course, just by seeding it with those that are most central, you get faster diffusion and higher prevalence. And why did we use the marginal condition? Well, it turns out if you look at the literature on diffusion, a lot of new ideas and practices are first adopted and created on the margins of a community because those on the margins are free to innovate. They're not constrained by the network, and they have an incentive to do so. And then there was this review by Floodgren and others where they found 18 trials. Some of them were opinion leaders versus no intervention, 1, 2, 3 other interventions. And across all of them, what they find is a 12 percentage point difference in compliance or behavior change. Now, that's a huge effect. Right? I teach program evaluation, and what we know from meta-analysis of interventions is we're lucky if we get 3 or 4 percentage point change with our interventions. The fact that you can get 12 percentage point changes just by using the network approach is incredibly significant. And why we aren't doing this all of the time, everywhere, all at once, that is a contemporary reference. I don't know, because hospitals all across the country should be doing this all of the time to improve their evidence-based practices. Now, the easiest thing that we can do with network data is calculate in-degree centrality. And as Jim talked about yesterday, it turns out in-degree centrality is incredibly robust to missing data. So it's great to use in the field because if you go into a hospital and you collect data and you only get a 50% response rate, you can still validly and reliably identify those peer opinion leaders and use them to be change agents. And it's, like I say, you can use other centrality measures, but in-degree centrality works really, really well. And then this is just a sample data set, right? UCINet, there's the network. One of the things I always like to point out, so I have tons of data like this, right? These are 12-year-old kids in school. We ask them to name their 5 closest friends, and you can see clearly there's 2 different groups, right? And I bet most of you, since a lot of you are sociologists, know what constitutes the group on the right versus the group on the left. Gender, right? Thank you for filling in the blank. What did you say, Jen? Oh, girls are icky, yeah. Well, and it's funny, too, because a lot of times you'll find a few girls who will admit to having a boyfriend, but boys will never admit having a girlfriend. And I remember looking at this. My daughter was about 12 at the time I saw this, and I thought, this is great. I've got nothing to worry about, Little did I know. Okay. And then there's a lot of theoretical work and very interesting work to be done because you actually, once you identify those peer opinion leaders, what do you do with them, right? And there are a lot of different things that you can do with them. And I think it's going to be interesting as we develop out the science of network interventions, this continuum of passive involvement by the opinion leaders versus active involvement, right? And one of the early great studies in this field was done by Lomas, promoting vaginal birth after first C-section, which is still an issue, believe it or not. And they had guys, wearing badges and all kinds of different things to say, ask me about VBAC, right? And so that's a more active process rather than something passive. Now, the other thing that we could do, which we don't do, is identify bridging nodes in a network, right? Because sometimes we've got networks like those adolescents where there's different, there's different subgroups, and you want to create more cohesiveness. Think about mergers and acquisitions, two departments join one another, that kind of thing. And I argue that bridging nodes might be easier to work with because they're not as constrained as central nodes in terms of their behavior. And just as a side note, we focus a lot. Jim said earlier yesterday, I think it was, where he said, one of the ways you get kudos in the network field, you become an expert, is by publishing a centrality measure, right? I published a centrality measure back in the 90s, a version of closeness. Well, the thing I've focused a little bit on lately is now identifying ways we don't have very many measures of bridges in network. We have Ron Burt's notion of constraint and the inverse of constraint, but we've published a couple lately, one in 2010 and another one in 2016. And of course, we might identify peripheral or isolated nodes for certain kinds of interventions. And then, of course, this notion of identifying low threshold adopters, right? If we can recruit them to be our change agents, we're ready to go because they're used to adopting early. They're used to convincing other people to adopt new behaviors and so on. All right, and then these are just the steps in the process. We'll learn more about this morning, about what happens in the real world when we do this. The second strategy for network interventions is the idea of segmentation, right? That you find subgroups. We spent a lot of time talking about communities yesterday, right? We've got a lot of different community detection algorithms. You find subgroups in the network, and you get them all to change behavior at the same time. And there are some behaviors for which that's incredibly the only way to get behavior change, because everybody has to adopt the innovation for it to happen, right? You think about, adopting a new computer system in a department. Everybody's got to do it, otherwise you've got incompatibilities. And I won't go into any details. You all have a lot of experience about ways that we can identify groups in networks, and then this nice little graph saying, networks are oftentimes modular, and it's good to define them. And then, again, here, there are implementation issues with that, right? Do they need to be the same size? Do we need to consider the attributes of the individuals? Do they need to be homophilous or heterogeneous on different kinds of characteristics? And then the other segmentation approach is to identify positions rather than groups. They may be more difficult to organize because, by definition, they may not be directly connected to one another. But again, there may be some settings. I think particularly about human service organizations where you have line personnel, program managers, directors, and so on at different levels of the hierarchy, and that may make a difference for whether or not the innovation is appropriate for them. And again, implementation issues there. Now, the coolest, at least in my opinion, kind of strategy is the notion of induction, right? So in strategies 1 and 2, we use the network to identify individuals and groups, whereas strategy 3, induction, is a little bit more difficult to define, and it may be easier to understand by example rather than definition, but I describe it as actually sort of activating the network, trying to excite behavior change on the network. And there are a couple of different tactics that we have in this realm. One, of course, is word of mouth, right? And that's been an old communication strategy for a long time. People create advertising campaigns, and the idea is to get people to talk about it, make it go viral. And in the world today, we have online retailers build this in, right? You purchase tickets on StubHub, and you can automatically have that purchase posted to your Instagram, Facebook, Discord, what was the other? Be Real, all of those different social media ones we were talking about this morning. And then we had a bit of information about respondent-driven sampling, which I found very interesting yesterday. And although it's rarely used as an intervention strategy, in fact, when you're doing RDS, that is interpreted as an intervention in the community. It may not be designed to do that. It's typically designed to make population-level estimates about prevalence and behaviors and so on, but actually people in the community see it as an intervention. And then finally, when we combine this notion of identifying individuals and identifying groups, then the question becomes, well, do we need to impose a leadership structure on these groups, right? Or when we identify leaders, do we need to figure out and make clear for them who they're going to lead for? And so it's back in 1999, we came up with this theoretical idea to sort of say, let's match leaders to groups. In other words, rather than just identifying the leaders and say, okay, go forth and communicate and convert, we say, No, you're going to go forth and communicate and convert specifically to these people. So here's a network. We identify the most central folks in the network, and then we match them to the persons that they're closest to sociometrically, right? So either directly or indirectly connected to. And this way, it says to 32, these are the people that think you're a leader. You'll be responsible for them learning about this new behavior or this idea. And in my world, in an ideal world, right, I fantasize about having organizations with this kind of structure across different domains. So you have different people being leaders for different kinds of activities and behaviors, which makes a lot of sense because people specialize in different things. And what was really cool is we wrote the theoretical paper with simulations in '99, and then I interviewed for a job at USC to lead our Master's in Public Health program, and they had an existing grant funded to do tobacco prevention in schools, right? And in that program, they were going to compare our standard social influences kind of curriculum with one that's culturally tailored. And this was the whole idea. We need to make our interventions tailored to the communities that have certain cultural things. We have a lot of cultural diversity in Southern California, and so we created this program. And so I came in late to the game, but I said, hey, I have an idea, right? Let's go ahead. Typically what happens in schools is teachers, they'll collect network data, right? They'll put a roster up on the board or on the screen and say to the kids, take out a piece of paper, write down the 5 kids you want to be, that you think would make best leaders for a project in class. Teacher gets it, gathers them all up, does a tally in degree centrality again, just like that. And then 2 things happen, right? One is, and it's not the teacher's fault, but the first thing that they do, of course, is after they've done the tallying, they decide to edit the data, right? They go, Tom Valente is a leader? I don't think so. This would be a disaster, right? He's constantly creating problems in school. So we'll scratch that one off and we'll go to the next person down on the list. And then the second thing they do, which for us is criminal, is then they throw the data away, right? And so what I said is, let's not do those things. Let's have them send the data to us. I wrote a Gauss program to identify leaders and match them to their followers, and then we'll test it out in this kind of randomized controlled trial across classrooms in these 16 different schools, almost 90 different classrooms. And what did we find? Lo and behold, right? If you do nothing else but identify opinion leaders and match them to their followers, you get improved performance on program appeal, and you get improved outcomes on smoking attitudes, self-efficacy, and the big kicker was susceptibility to smoke, right? And we know that predicts becoming a smoker, and so that was a huge, huge effect, right? And then we aggregate up to the classroom, we get the same thing. And then in the 1-year follow-up, what do we find? Sure enough, right? When we compare the 2 curricula, we find that in the culturally tailored curriculum, using the network approach was more effective at slowing the uptake of smoking. Awesome. And the teacher condition did the best, right? So the teacher's better than my algorithm, which is not surprising. Nobody's surprised about that, least of all your author. And then we submitted this paper to the Journal of School Health, right? It was a high-impact journal. They're going to love this. It's saying such great things about teachers. They trashed it. I didn't like it at all. So, but what we found, of course, is that this network condition, actually there was another intervention that had happened in 1999 by David Buehler with eating behavior in organizations, and they had a really successful time with that as well. But what we find, of course, is this network condition is most appealing. It reduced pro-tobacco attitudes, reduced susceptibility. And then we replicated it a couple years later. I have a colleague named Steve Sussman who has an evidence-based program called Towards No Drug Abuse. And, we were talking in the hall, and he goes, well, with the new curriculum, I can see how a network approach might be effective. But what about an existing program? Can we make that better by using a network approach? And so we did that, right? And we had as our prime directive to create this TND network, compare it to TND vanilla, and see if it's more effective. And it was. So the key take-homes here are that network methods are effective at changing short-term outcomes. We have these turnkey network-based interventions now, but they're sensitive to curriculum. And this is the really important idea that in public health, we typically ignore the social context of behavior. We don't measure who people consume interventions with, right? And I guarantee you that makes a huge difference. If I go to a movie and I watch it with person A versus person B, I may have a completely different reaction to it based on their reactions to it. So that social context is important, and how the curriculum is received is important from a network perspective. And then we can talk about other things. Then finally, the fourth strategy, which I initially called manipulation, right? And I realized, that's not really what we want to sell here, right? We want to talk about alteration. We're tailors. We're making things nice so that they fit better. And we have three different tactics to that, right? We can delete or add nodes. and the military spends a lot of time on deleting nodes, right? That's their prime objective in a lot of settings. Or we can change links, or we can rewire the entire network. How do we do this? Well, you calculate, excuse me, some kind of network metric. Oftentimes we use cohesion, right? The inverse of the average path length. Delete a node, recalculate the metric, calculate the difference, and those with the largest difference are the most important. This is referred to as vitality in the network literature. The other thing to do, of course, is to change links, right? So again, we calculate a network metric, delete a link, recalculate the metric, and then calculate the difference. The links with the largest differences are the most important. And then what you can do, of course, is delete existing links or add new links, and you get this change matrix, right? Which is a measure of how much cohesion changes when you delete or add links. And now you can do stuff with that change matrix as a way to understand the structures in the network. And again, we have implementation issues for that. Do we know which structural metric to maximize? If we make one change, do we need to make another? Is it a zero-sum game? And then, of course, we've got all kinds of network dynamics to worry about here when we're trying to do this actually in the field. And so it could be challenging. And then the other thing I like to observe, of course, is rewiring networks is really difficult. People have affiliations and affinities with others for a whole bunch of reasons that are somewhat complicated and may even be hard to measure. And so I'm not sure we haven't done much of this in the real world, but we will see. Now then, of course, the other idea is to rewire networks, right? So we can take an existing network and rewire it to be a different kind of network. Now, organizations do this a lot by architecturally changing the way the organization is structured. Right? If they want to, they want to put a water cooler in the middle of the office space, they want to have open plans or closed plans or whatnot. And so they're basically trying to change the network structure in order to make it, to get some desirable outcomes. And then I also like to point out, for a long time, in the early days of network analysis, we were always strutting our stuff saying, yeah, everybody ignores networks. We care about relations. We know they're more important. But then, of course, we oftentimes ignore the attributes of those people, right? We think of our network as nodes. But I like to say nodes are people, so they have characteristics. Let's make sure we incorporate that. And then this is one of the few studies I found that's published that actually tried this sort of rewiring approach in an elementary school classroom. They measured kids who they liked and didn't like, and then they rearranged the seating to have kids who said that they didn't like others sit next to one another, and then they found out at the post-test, of course, that now they like them or dislike them a lot less. So we go back to our table. Here it is. And this has been extended by a couple of people in a couple of different publications, which I'll share with you. And then I just like to say, well, I like the graphics. Here is the graphical display of all these different network interventions. And then I like to keep that box down there in the lower right-hand corner because there are people introducing new ideas that are beyond the scope of that table up here in the upper left-hand corner. So I think, there's a lot more that we can do with network interventions. And just as an aside, we do have an R script to calculate all of these things. It's not very pretty at this stage because, again, I'm a pretty terrible programmer. So how do you select a network intervention? Well, there are considerations. What kind of network data do you have? What does that structure look like? Where are we in terms of prevalence of that behavior? Is it brand new? Is it old? What are its perceived characteristics? In particular, cultural compatibility, which turns out to be critically important. Is it a behavior or an idea that will be readily endorsed or accepted by the community. And one of the reasons I do that, what are the structural influences on behaviors? Because really, in an ideal world, we could use theory to decide what kind of intervention to choose, right? If we know the mechanism that's driving the behavior, that does suggest certain kinds of strategies and tactics to employ to do the intervention. Right, now back to Snappy. We've done our program design. What about implementation? And so a number of years ago, my colleague Sabina Giselle came up with this idea of creating network diagnostics, right? Let's use network data while we're implementing a program in order to make midterm changes. We published a paper on this thing. And basically in this proposal, what we did is said, what are some of the key network metrics that you're all familiar with? What should they look like if we're doing an intervention with a group of people? And so we put this table in, we send the paper off to a journal, and I knew what was going to happen. The reviewers are going to be, where in God's name did you get these threshold numbers from? All three reviewers were critical about that. And I wrote them back and I said, yeah, I don't know. I just made it up, frankly, because nobody's ever done this before. And lo and behold, they're like, yeah, that sounds about right. Shocked the heck out of me. If NIH would behave like that, I'd be a lot happier. And then one of the last things to discuss is what kind, I'm talking about networks in general, and in fact, we have different kinds of networks and they serve different functions, right? And in particular, when we're doing interventions in organizations, there are two kinds of networks we typically measure. And this goes all the way back to Coleman, Katz, and Menzel in the mid-1950s, right? Who do you go to for advice and who do you discuss matters with? The one taps into expertise, the other trust. And again, going back to communication theory all the way back to 40s and 50s, those tend to be the two things that enable people to convince others, right? And depending on the behavior, depending on the setting, you may want to work with advice networks or discussion networks. And I like to say that they really have two different dimensions, right? And you can find people that are low and high in either expertise or trust. And of course, ideally, we find opinion leaders down here, right? They're high in expertise and they're high in trust. And I like to think about them as sort of hierarchical, vertical versus horizontal. Okay, and then when the barrier is technical, right? You don't know how to do something, expertise is important. But when the barrier to change is cultural, you don't know what to do, trust becomes important. So in conclusion, network methods, I think, are great for interventions. They capitalize on existing interpersonal relationships. They use community input, and they let the community become a learning organization, right? And it feeds right into this notion of social capital. And when people are contributing their network data, excuse me, then they're actually involved and empowered in the process. And we can replicate them, right? We have fidelity. How well did our matching algorithm work? And it really does create a lot of options for us in the public health context. And so that wraps it up for what I have to say. And if there are any quick questions, I think we have a minute or two for that. So thank you all very much for your attention.
Any quick clarifying questions on the particulars, and then we will, while we switch over, and then we can come back together at the end for a joint discussion.
I must have been crystal clear. Yes.
There was a slide that said WOM on it.
Word of mouth.